Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, June 4th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the New York City mayoral election, the Democratic primary that is set to take place later on this month, as a wide range of candidates who have entered into the field are all competing against former Governor Andrew Cuomo in the New York City mayoral election. Now, if you remember my videos 4 years ago, we briefly talked about the 2021 New York mayoral elections. We talked primarily about the Democratic primary because in the state of New York, the primary is what matters. Republicans haven't held the mayoral election in a little bit of time, but realistically speaking, nobody besides a Democrat is going to win this election. And so what we remember, and I think that we talked about this at length before, was back that day, June 22nd. The election that took place in 2021, it was a ranked choice election similar to this time around, if you were wondering. But what we saw was that Eric Adams was chosen as the Democratic nominee for mayor of New York. He had beaten out Catherine Garcia and Maya Wiley and Andrew Yang. Andrew Yang, yes, the one who ran for president. And it was a race that was arguably extremely competitive, but many people didn't really expect it to be this narrow by the end of it. There were definitely a number of people who are more on the progressive left side of things who were hoping that Maya Wiley might get into this position where she was boosted up, that maybe there would be, a one-to-one race against Eric Adams and Maya Wiley rather than Catherine Garcia. And so all of this speculation, all of this conversation, the point is that Eric Adams won. And he became quickly, and over time, an unpopular mayor. Enough so that this time around, he's deciding not to opt in, running for the Democratic nomination, but instead is running as an independent candidate. And so it definitely is at an interesting point, at bare minimum, that Eric Adams is going to be on the ballot as this independent, but the Democratic primary is really what's going to be king or queen maker. I mean, that's the term that I'd like to use there. And so looking at the major candidates, there are two that really catch my eye. Zoran Mamdani and Andrew Cuomo, two people who have very much been the biggest names we've seen thus far in the race, have made the biggest amount of news, have done the most press hits, have done the most, in many cases, a lot of spending, and just have more higher name ID rather, than the rest of the other candidates in the field. And while the other candidates may not be in a position where they are going to be challenging Andrew Cuomo head-to-head, many of them will matter. Because New York City does a ranked choice voting system in the Democratic primary, what this essentially means is that people will rank their candidates 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which means that your fourth place vote might count just as much as your first place vote if it ends up being that the race is between your fourth and fifth pick. And so that's why a lot of them are largely competing not just between each other, but for each other as well. They are competing for the voting groups and electorates that might say, hey, I want, Brad Lander, but if he doesn't win, then I want, Andrew Cuomo or vice versa or another set of circumstances. The point is that you are actively competing. And what has made this race quite interesting is that Andrew Cuomo, as the former governor, has been really brought back into electoral politics. Now, I also don't know if you remember that shortly after that mayoral election in New York City, Andrew Cuomo received a wide array of sexual assault and misconduct allegations coming towards his office. People who have come out publicly, people came out privately, went through the Attorney General's office in New York, and what happened was that almost all of Andrew Cuomo's allies turned their backs on him. They said this is something that is abhorrent, right? They couldn't stand by it. They couldn't stand to see a governor in a day and age that Democrats had been actively pursuing investigations against Donald Trump, had just beaten him in the last presidential election. And so it was this huge reckoning point for the New York Democratic Party, enough so that Cuomo lost all of his allies, that he felt he needed to resign. Yes, as governor. And I know this is something that was huge news 4 years ago. It might not be active in your mind this time around, but it certainly is relevant. But then Andrew Cuomo recently came out and said that, he regrets resigning as governor, that he wishes in a better set of circumstances, at least for him, that he would not have resigned as governor. And so obviously, this is something you say in hindsight, something that you now are going to obviously say. But at the moment, Andrew Cuomo should have resigned, right? I mean, that is what the objective opinion was from political thought makers, right? All these people who had been spending a lot of time watching Cuomo's rise through COVID-19, watching the way he had handled interactions with the Biden and Trump administrations, all of these things, right? It made sense for Cuomo to resign. And now he's running for mayor, which puts him at a point of liability that a lot of people remember that he was governor and had to resign as governor. These aren't things that people, forget about, but it is something that makes a difference. But it is interesting that he's taking this point because Andrew Cuomo very much is trying to do a redemption or a comeback, as better put, for himself and the city. At least it seems, right? His whole thing is about beginning anew because everybody knows that Cuomo resigned. Well, why am I talking about this? Well, all of this context is necessary in understanding that Andrew Cuomo coming into this race had a lot of visibility. Everybody knew who he was, and he started out with a pretty commanding lead. He started out being what many people thought was unbeatable. He was at a position where he was polling 30, 40, sometimes 50 points ahead, and it really was a strong enough position that sometimes you wouldn't even need to get to round 2. And Andrew Cuomo would already be above the 50% threshold. You need 50% to stop the counting and win your election in ranked choice voting. And so for Andrew Cuomo, right, what we saw was that there was this continuous uptick seemingly in support for him in the mayoral election. But after a long set of campaigns and a long time for other Democrats to really find their footing, the race has gotten certainly closer. And so now what we're seeing, the most recent Emerson College poll, still shows Andrew Cuomo leading. But Zohran Mamdani, someone who has been very much to the left of Andrew Cuomo in nearly every regard, is starting to gain a lot of ground against him. Because early on in this race, you can see the numbers weren't good for Mamdani. When we started off in January, he was polling at 4.4%. And over time, things started to get better, but it wasn't really until the end of March, 2 months ago really, that he was even at a second place point. But at this point, he was only at 13%. You can see that Cuomo was still at a whopping 37%. At the same point, Mamdani was at 13%. The rest of the candidates were hovering at 8, 8.1, 5.6, 4.4, 2.2, and it was pretty standard, right? That we saw that, Mamdani, looking at this race, probably wasn't going to come within reach of winning this mayoral election. And although it is true that Andrew Cuomo is maintaining a lead, it certainly is true that it has tightened. Take a look at the numbers we're seeing here. Emerson College, again, did this in one of the most recent polls. This was 5 days ago. In the first round, Mamdani is still trailing Cuomo by roughly 13 points. But as more and more of these Democratic candidates get eliminated, it seems as if they are much more open to choosing anybody else besides Andrew Cuomo. Between the first and fifth round, Andrew Cuomo only gains 0.9%. Now this, as the person who's the most prominent, with the highest visibility, with the biggest name ID, what this suggests is that this isn't a lack of people knowing Andrew Cuomo. It's a lack of people wanting Andrew Cuomo in this race. And so what we found from the first to fifth race is 0.9% difference. By the sixth round, 37.7. By the seventh round, 38.6. By the eighth round, then the ninth round, it takes Cuomo all the way to the 10th round to win. Keep in mind, some of the data we had been looking at before put Cuomo in a position where by the time we had reached, the third round, he was able to take the win. Take a look at this. We see Marist University. They did a poll back in the first week of May, so over or roughly a month ago. And what they found was that Mamdani was still at 22%. It doesn't seem like his numbers improved that much. But what we see is a huge drop-off from what Cuomo's support was versus now. 44% versus today, 35%. And by the time you reached the second round, and once you started to see the elimination, not second round, but the third or fourth round, Cuomo just went up to 50%. By the time they had written the whole thing out, and what you'll find in the data is that he wins with over 53% of the vote. And so although Emerson College is suggesting that he does win the election by 9, it certainly is way closer than coming from a position where you're winning by 39. Right? And so it's a good standpoint that, at least for Mamdani, that the numbers are getting better. And a bad one for Cuomo because the directions aren't moving in a direction that Cuomo wants them to move in. Now, I think looking at it from these numbers, one could very reasonably conclude that Cuomo's going to win. If I was to call the race today, Cuomo probably would win the race today. And he still very well might win the inevitable New York City mayoral election. He has a lot of visibility. A lot of people have changed their minds about Andrew Cuomo. A lot of people who called on him to resign are now endorsing him for mayor. I mean, there is a huge 180 with a lot of these Democrats, including voters, on their perception of Andrew Cuomo. But it doesn't mean that he is locked and guaranteed in this race like he once was 2 months ago, like he once was even a month ago. The race is tightening. Things are getting closer. And Zohran Mamdani seems to be the only other Democrat out of the range of 10 that could defeat Andrew Cuomo head-to-head. And that isn't to say that he will win against Cuomo, but it is to say there is a higher chance of that today than there has been ever before. And it is a better position today than it had been for the past 6 months. And so I do think that come in time for this primary, it's going to be close. Might it be as close as 2021? It very well may be, because that's the way that these elections tend to go. And although 2021 didn't have an Andrew Cuomo type figure, I do think that we are seeing a very similar set of circumstances. A more center, moderate left versus a more progressive left. That's what happened in 2021. That's what tends to happen in Democratic primaries, except it's very rarely this close. But I wouldn't be shocked if it was this time around. So keep your eye out on the New York City mayoral race. I know I don't typically talk about mayoral elections all the time, but given that this is, a super influential city, the largest in America, it definitely makes sense to talk about. It definitely makes sense to take a look at this district that comprises multitudes of congressional districts, could be its own state off population by far, easily, right? So definitely worth talking about. Keep your eyes on it. Keep your eyes peeled on upcoming polls, because it is going to be very fascinating to watch that as we get through the next few weeks leading into the eventual primary. It's going to be a fun race to watch because it's going to get a lot closer than anyone could have predicted. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 House election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.